Okay, so today's discussion is going to be about, or this lecture at least, is going to be about elections, nominations, and campaigns. By the way, if you're wondering what's behind me, I'm actually in my kitchen right now, and that is those are pictures that we have on the wall. My wife actually put this together, and we just have, right by our kitchen table, we have a big thing of just pictures of different members of the family, things like that. Like, so, for example, that's my father-in-law. Right, that's my son. That's my older daughter. There's me. There's Nancy, my wife. So we have all kinds of pictures on here. There's, by the way, there's my son when he was a police cadet with Chief Bratton. Kind of cool. And up there somewhere, although I can't see where it is right now, I can't find it, but there's a small picture of Hillary Clinton up there. Oh, way up there. Way up there. See that tiny little thing right there? That's Hillary Clinton. My daughter and son went to a rally and took a picture. So that's my segue into talking about elections. So the main goal of today is going to be to try and explain something that a lot of people know about but don't quite understand why it's the case. And that is, why is it that if most people are ideologically moderate, if most people are kind of in the middle of the political spectrum, why is it that our leaders are not? Our leaders are mostly extreme. And so it turns out that there's not a simple explanation, but there is an explanation for that. And by the end of this lecture, you will know that explanation. And so that's where we're going to start. So, on with the lecture. Elections are crucial to maintaining popular sovereignty. In other words, popular sovereignty meaning the people are in charge. The way that we stay in charge is by going ahead and selecting leaders every 2 years, every 4 years, we get to select our leaders. And what we do is we go ahead and we make sure that we vote for people who are similar to us, who have preferences that are similar to ours, that they want to do the same kind of things that we want to do. That you don't usually agree on everything that a candidate says, but you generally sort of try and find somebody who more or less is going to agree with what you want done. And the way it should work, in order for us to maintain control, is that people should be able to elect candidates who are closest to their own preferences. If I'm somebody who's a conservative, when the election comes around, I should be able to pick somebody or vote for somebody who's got views similar to my own. Liberals should be able to vote for a liberal. Conservatives should be able to vote for a conservative. Moderates should be able to vote for a moderate. There should be a choice that we have when we're voting for somebody who's similar in our views. Maybe not exact, but at least somebody who's close. And as I said to you before, citizens are mostly moderates. If you were to go ahead and you look at the population, if you take a look on your graph, on your lecture notes right now, what you'll see is what's called a histogram. It's a distribution of if you were going to list all the people and ask them to state what they were, if you were to do a public opinion poll, and you were to say, I want you to rate yourself on a scale of 0 to 100. Are you extremely liberal? That's going to be a 0. Are you extremely conservative? That's 100. And then everything in between. You can pick any number, 0, 5, 8, and then 50 is moderate. That if you were to go ahead and you were to ask the entire population to do that, and everybody ranked themselves by how liberal or conservative they were, if you look at that graph where you can see that everybody falls in sort of the middle range, it winds up being that most people are moderate, or at least they're close to being moderate. Right? There are a few people who are very, very liberal. There are a few people who are very, very conservative. But for the most part, people are grouped towards the center. Most people are moderates. Probably you're moderate. You're probably somewhere in the center of the political spectrum. Not a lot of people are very, very extreme. Well, the reason I point that out is that if most people are moderates or close to the center, then our elected officials should be moderate. They should be moderate. If that's what we look like, if most of us are towards the center of the ideological spectrum, then you would think that our political leaders would be around the ideological spectrum. If most of us were really extreme, you'd expect our leaders to be really extreme. Well, as it turns out, as I said, most people are moderates. Our elected officials should be moderate, but it turns out that most of our elected officials are very extreme. Almost all are very extreme. And the goal of today's lecture is to go ahead and explain to you why that's the case. How did it work out that if most people are moderate, our leaders are very extreme? Now, to do that, I have to start off with some distinctions about different kinds of elections. And a particularly important distinction that I'm going to be making is the difference between primary elections and a general election. So let's start first with primary elections. In a primary election, what's going on is candidates of the same party are running against one another. So, for example, in the primary that we're having in 2012, what you have is you have 4 Republican candidates running against one another. Mitt Romney, Rick Santorum, Newt Gingrich, and Ron Paul. All of them are Republicans. And then this year, in the Democratic primary, since President Obama is the sitting president, no other Democrat is trying to win the Democratic primary. But in a regular election where there wasn't a sitting president, you would have more than one Democrat running as well. So if you look on the lecture notes, I have R1, R2, R3, and R4. That's supposed to represent 4 Republican candidates. They're all running against one another in the primary elections. And then I show on the lecture notes, I have Democrats. I only have 3 Democrats because it doesn't have to be the same number of Democrats and Republicans running against one another. So in this example, but it could be different, there are 3 Democrats. So that's where you see D1, D2, and D3. They're all running against one another. And what's going to happen is whoever wins in the Republican primary is going to move on to the general election. Whoever wins in the Democratic primary is going to move on to the general election. The primary is kind of like the playoffs. And whoever wins the playoffs gets to go to the championship game. That's how you can think of it, that they're going to move on. Or I guess baseball, it's they win the pennant and then they move on to the World Series. So it's like the first phase of it is the Republican primary. Whoever wins, so in this example, you can see I have R3, Republican number 3, and Democrat number 2, winning the elections, winning the primary elections. So the Republicans run against the Republicans, Democrats run against Democrats, and whoever wins, the winner moves on. They win the nomination, and then they move on to the general election. Now we call them the nominees. In a general election, the nominees of different parties run against one another. So if you look down there, you see R3 versus D2. What we have are the Republican who won and the Democrat who won running against one another for each office. So that can be for the president, for governor, for state senator, for mayor. It can be any number of offices, but the process is still the same all the way through. Primary election, whoever wins the primary moves over to the general election, and that's how we do our setup. Now, it's important for a second to keep in mind a difference between the primary and general election. To go ahead and vote correctly, and by correctly, before I even say anything, let me explain what I mean by correctly. When I say voting correctly, I'm not talking about you voting for the person that I think you should vote for. I'm talking about you voting for the candidate who's closest to your preferences, the person who's going to do the things that you want them to do. That's what I mean by voting correctly. To vote correctly, citizens need more information in the primaries than in the general election. Now think about it for a second. Why would that be? Look at your notes again on the Republican primary. And again, the way it works usually is either the only people voting in a Republican primary are either going to be Republicans alone or sometimes Republicans and independents. But let's just imagine you're talking about just Republicans voting in a Republican primary. Why might it be hard to vote in a Republican primary if all the candidates before you are Republicans? Well, they all have the same party label. If you're somebody who votes Republican all the time, in a general election, when you have a Republican and a Democrat, pretty easy to figure out how to vote. You vote for the Republican. Doesn't take much research. But if you're a Republican in a Republican primary, you need to do a lot of information because you need a lot of information because you can't just rely on the party label to help you make that decision. It requires more information. Now, the reason that's important is that the only people who are willing to go ahead and expend the energy to go ahead and gather up that information are usually people with very strong views. Usually these are people who are really into politics, right? These are hardcore Republicans or hardcore Democrats. These are people who like politics. And they're willing to expend the information, the time and the money, the energy, not the money, the time and the energy to get the information they need to distinguish between all those Republicans, all those people with the same label. They can go ahead and say, okay, you know what, I'm going to find out about Republican number 1 and Republican number 2 and 3 and 4, and then decide which one I think is the Republican that I want to have in the general election. So this is important to keep in mind. The people who vote in primary elections tend to be people who have really strong views. They're the ones who are willing to expend the energy that they need to distinguish between the various Republicans. The same thing is true for Democrats. When they go ahead and the people who are participating in Democratic primaries tend to be the ones who are really into it a lot, and they're willing to expend the energy to find out which Democrat they want to vote for. Now, after this, we'll move on to the process of nominating presidential candidates.